with Question Time.
Tonight's Question Time comes from the Hampshire town of Basingstoke. Once a quaint market town, it's grown massively since the 60s as London's commuter belt spread outwards. Politically, it's always been a safe Conservative seat, until this summer when a Labour MP was elected here for the very first time. Our audience members have been preparing their questions and thoughts for our panel as usual, and as a group, they reflect the general electoral picture across the nation. And tonight they want to talk about Donald Trump and Elon Musk. What does that particular combo mean for the US and for us? And the Prime Minister says we can meet our climate change targets without the government telling us how to live our lives. Really? Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel from the government is Jonathan Reynolds. He is the Secretary of State for Business and Trade and was elected to Parliament in 2010 as MP for Stalybridge and Hyde. Damian Hinds was Education Secretary when Theresa May was PM. He's held ministerial positions under 4 Prime Ministers in total, including prisons, employment and security and borders. Making her first appearance on Question Time is the Green Party's Ellie Chowns. She speaks for her party on housing and communities and is one of 4 Green MPs in Parliament. Also appearing for the first time is Greg Jackson. He was entrepreneurial even at school, programming computer games. Now he's the founder and CEO of Octopus Energy, the country's largest electricity supplier. And Tim Stanley is an historian, author and journalist. He's a sketch writer and columnist at The Telegraph. And his most recent book, Whatever Happened to Tradition, says progress is only possible if we respect the past. Good evening. Welcome to our panel. Welcome to our audience here in Basingstoke. Lovely to see you all. And, of course, welcome to you at home. You can follow the programme in all sorts of ways, on iPlayer, on BBC Sounds, and, of course, you can put in your 10 penneth on social media as well. It's always pretty lively. Right, let's start with our first question tonight, which is from Jan Hampston. Off you go.
How does the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, think he can achieve his new net zero targets without telling us how to live our lives?
Yes, and a particularly pertinent question, given it's COP29, it has been for the last few days, and it continues in Azerbaijan. Jonathan?
Well, first of all, these are clearly targets that we need to have, Jan. We have clearly got and are aware of the scale of the challenge around climate change, and the UK has got a major role to play in harnessing opinion around the world to come together to tackle that.
So Keir Starmer's saying we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 81% from 1990 levels by 2035. How can he do that without telling us how to live our lives?
Well, fundamentally, it's about innovation. You know, I look at this and I know there's an argument which says we can't have the kind of living standards that we've got if we meet these targets. We've got to, you know, eat grass or live in caves, right? And that's not what it's about. This is about how we can take advantage of new technology, take advantage of incredible opportunities to get the most for the UK. And I compare it to, you know, like the best-selling book, one of the best-selling books in the 1960s was called The Population Bomb, and it said there's no way the world's population can continue to grow without massive famine and starvation, and it'll all be terrible. None of it was true. It was the best-selling book of the 1960s, I believe. And the simple truth is that human beings are full of innovation, full of opportunity. Look at how we already have changed as a country, our electricity supply. Look at how we're changing transport. Look, climate change for me, honestly, 3 priorities: jobs, jobs, jobs again, right? This is the biggest economic opportunity this country has had in decades, and we should be at the forefront of it.
All right.
So, Jan, it's not about telling people what to do. It's about getting the maximum benefits of what we have to do for the UK, and that's what this government's committed to.
Well, there's a number of things that climate scientists, and indeed our own climate change committee, say we need to do if we're going to get anywhere near reducing emissions to that extent. One of them, for example, is reducing our intake of meat and dairy. So the UN estimates that livestock emissions make up something like 14% of man-made greenhouse gases. How are you going to make us eat less meat and dairy without telling us what to do?
Look, I don't take, to be honest, much truck for this. I don't think this is about telling people what they can eat. There'll be innovations in food production.
Do you think we don't need to eat less meat and dairy?
Well, I can't say I've personally committed to doing that, so I wouldn't expect anyone else to do the same.
I think you've got the Climate Change Committee saying that is what we need to do.
I think there has been major innovation already in how food is produced. And I think, look, this is just 2 pessimistic a tone to take on this. This is about opportunity. It's about prosperity. If the UK wasn't at the forefront of this, we would miss out. And I think trying to sort of scare people into, like, your life's not going to be good and you can't eat the same food, that is not what this is about. It's about jobs, economic opportunity, investment in the UK. And if we were not leading, as we need to lead on this, we would be missing out on those things.
So, Damian, that's one view. You've got others taking the view that unless you do start telling people what to do, for example, the hard things, like eating less meat and dairy, we just haven't got a hope in hell of meeting these emissions targets.
So what you don't want to do is start telling people how to live their lives. What you do want to do is find ways to achieve the carbon emissions reductions that we need to make by going with the grain of people's lives, ideally by helping people's lives to be better. You know, when you find ways to make heating cheaper, and, you know, obviously you're cutting carbon emissions, but that's a benefit to people. That's what you want to try and find. And look, our country has long been a leader in tackling climate change. We were the first major nation to halve emissions. We were the first major nation to have an end date for unabated coal. And we continue to be a leader, and that is quite right. And along the way,
that is partly due to a considerable decrease in manufacturing in this country, and we're buying steel from other countries. So the emissions are coming from them.
Overwhelmingly, the benefit to date has been about decarbonising the electricity supply and the reduction in coal. And there's been some progress. There's been progress elsewhere, like on transport and industry, but we need more of that. We need more of that to come. It hasn't always been clear how it will come. And I remember when I was a Minister looking after fiscal policy on energy back in 2015, people were always saying, oh, you've got these carbon budgets, but you've met them to date, you will not meet them in future. The country can innovate, and it does innovate. But where I take issue with the Prime Minister over this announcement this week, a 78% reduction was already a very stretching reduction. We were going to have to come up with a lot more things, a lot more ideas about how we were going to get there and rely on that kind of innovation. And to just unilaterally say we're going to increase it now from 78% to 81%, it may sound like a small difference, but I'll tell you, in that 3%, there's an awful lot of work to be done. And there is no detail about how he thinks we can get there. It's just like asserting that we can do something without saying what the means are to get there.
So, Ellie, as you're here representing the Green Party tonight, I assume you applaud the fact that the Prime Minister has increased the target. In terms of without telling us how to live our lives, I mean, many might argue that the easier things have been done, and it's the harder stuff now that needs to be done, which is why I picked on meat and dairy, for example. Because it's generally a consensus that meat and dairy consumption needs to reduce. Not necessarily get rid of it completely, but needs to reduce. Do you share that view?
Yes, I do share that view, but I don't think at all it's about telling people what to do. And I don't think anybody wants to be. You do that. You do it by encouragement, but you also do it by making it easier for people. I mean, government over many years has they've encouraged us to eat 5 a day, for example, and now we think. But we all think it's a good thing to do, right?
But people aren't necessarily doing it. So I mean, I noticed at one point the Green Party was suggesting taxing red meat and dairy. You're not suggesting that anymore. That's
not in our manifesto, no. But we have said in our manifesto we do recognise that reducing meat and dairy is part of the action we need to tackle climate change.
Reducing meat and dairy production?
I just want to kind of return to what Damian was saying there about the increase in the target. It's not true that there's no clarity about how to achieve it, because all Keir Starmer has done is adopt the target that the Committee on Climate Change says that we need to have, and they've got a huge report setting out exactly how we can and should do it as a country. With all of these things, you know, if we'd acted earlier, it would be easier and it would be cheaper. But we are where we are now. And the reality is, we've just heard this week, you know, we are crashing and burning through that 1.5 degree above pre-industrial temperature level. The reality of climate change is something that's hugely recognised by the huge majority of people. So to return to your question, Jan, how can Keir Starmer help us to kind of get there without telling us what to do? Well, the job of government is to make it easier, to provide the public transport so that we're not so dependent on our cars, to support nature-friendly farming in a proper way. I was raising that in the Commons just today. And to help support insulation of homes, investment in new energy, but also to show that leadership and saying we won't burn fossil fuels anymore.
That's all very well, but everything you just described costs money. Either money coming from the government, or money coming from us by changing our consumption habits, or money coming from farmers by changing the way in which they do things.
And as we've seen in Valencia, not taking action costs huge amount of money and also human suffering.
Right.
The reality of the impacts of climate change is with us now. We can see that.
Yes.
We know it. And so Nick Stern told us 20 years ago, if we transition to net zero now, it'll be much cheaper than 20 years hence. The same applies
All right.
today.
Well, let's
put aside the debate about the impact and the science. I'm not disputing any of that. This is a question about method and pace. So the Prime Minister flew to Azerbaijan, a hereditary dictatorship, where the President opened proceedings at the COP summit by saying that fossil fuels were a gift from God, right? Britain is there representing 1% of global emissions. Powers that represent up to 60% of global emissions declined to attend, like China and India. Last year, the world used more coal than ever before in history. In other words, we're making a transition, good for us, moral leadership, way hey, but the rest of the world actually isn't. And the question is starting to emerge in consumers' minds, is my government making choices on my behalf, forcing me to live a certain way, to put up with either rationing or higher prices for energy, in order to make a very small dent in the overall amount of carbon being released?
So, Tim, I think you raised some really important points.
Thank you.
Energy cost is vital to the quality of life, and also, by the way, to the competitiveness of industry. But we've crossed the Rubicon now. Clean energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels. Power from wind and from solar is cheaper than power from fossil fuels. Consumers don't see the benefits. Our markets are still run in the old traditional way. We need market reform so that when we build wind farms, people get cheaper energy. It doesn't help that we keep paying wind farms to turn off when it's windy, instead of giving people cheap power at those times. But if we stand back and look at this, you talked about, China. For a long time, China, as we know, was building more and more coal plants. But it's also now leading the way in clean energy. 59% of all of the renewable energy built over the last year in the world has been built in China.
But they are also still building a huge number of...
An enormous number of those coal plants will never get used. Many are being mothballed. But the reality is, why are they doing that? It's not because they're nice people, although, by the way, they may be. It's because they recognise that now that clean energy is cheaper and energy is the engine of growth for their industry, they're investing in it. And I can tell you, 6 or 7 years ago, if you went to Chinese cities, people wore masks, face masks, not because of COVID, but because of air pollution. That's gone.
Okay, so
54% of the cars sold so far in this year.
Are they as reliable? So in the case in this country, when you have a period like we've recently had, where the wind dies and where the sun doesn't shine, what happens? You have to rely upon backup generation, which, by the way, is becoming harder to do because we've shut down coal. So what do? You rely on gas? Well, we're making that harder to do because we don't like exploration in the North Sea. So what do?
Well,
you import the power from overseas.
Allow me to help you with this answer.
There is one solution to this, which is nuclear, and the very same green people who are demanding...
You are going to get a word in at some point.
As somebody who buys more power than anybody in the UK, I can give you an authoritative answer on what we do. So the reality is, first of all, an electric car holds enough power in its battery for a typical house for the best part of a week. As more and more electric cars hit our roads, we have distributed storage of electricity that will get us through days on end without wind, right? It's not the whole solution, but it's a big part of it, and it helps us reduce our reliance on things like those fossil fuel backups. We're building more interconnectors. It's always windy somewhere. It's always sunny somewhere. So as we connect our country to others, when they're windy, we get their power. When we're windy, we sell ours to them. And by the way, we're one of the windiest places in the world. This is a huge export opportunity for the UK.
Right. Let me hear a bit from the audience, because there's been lots of hands up, and then you've sort of given up to put them down again. So let's come back to you. Yes, so let's just run to the question, which is, how does Keir Starmer think he can achieve his new net zero targets without telling us how to live our lives? Yes, Manda.
It's clear that there isn't agreement across the panel at all, and especially, I guess it's disappointing amongst the major parties that there isn't like a good way forward. Isn't it time for such an important issue that there's a cross-parliament approach bringing together the best minds?
Cross-parliament approach, yeah. We have a lot of calls for that kind of thing on all sorts of subjects. Yes, man there in the white shirt.
Hi. I think one point we're missing here is that as good as electric vehicles may sound, there's still the battery, and that has a short lifespan. At some point, that's going to have to be disposed of, and there's a lot of heavy metals in that, and that's going to cause pollution as well. OK, man further back in the grey sweater.
I agree with reductions, and I believe Labour announced hundreds of millions investment in carbon capture. And my question is that really the best way to invest in reducing CO2?
All right, and yes, the woman in the white top.
I feel like science has got us into this mess, so hopefully science can get us out of it. We put our heads together and had a solution for COVID with a vaccine very quickly when we were in a crisis. Why don't we treat this like the crisis it is and put the best science minds together in a room?
Can I just answer that? Because there's a gap between... This is important. The problem is that Britain has signed up to goals which close the gap between our ambition and where that innovation can get us and how fast it can get us there. I mean, the word innovation was used. That's a punt on the future. We will get there eventually. I'm sure renewables will eventually be abundant and cheap, but we're not there yet. But the government has closed the gap between now and then by tightening the targets. And you will pay for that through your bills and through purchasing, because you may well be forced to do things like buy heat pumps, etc. So this is all I'm saying is we already have one of the highest prices for energy in the world, which is very difficult, not just for the consumer, but for industry. The government is unnecessarily bringing forward morally minded targets such that you will have to pick up the tab while we wait for that innovation to come through.
Tim, can I help with two things? I mean, the first is you don't need to be forced to buy a heat pump. Sooner or later, companies are innovating to make them better than gas boilers. Okay? It's our responsibility and duty to do that. We need to get the market to scale, but it's happening.
But is that going to happen in time?
It's happening very quickly. 3 years ago, no one had heard of one. All of a sudden, they're everywhere. That's pretty remarkable.
Well, they're not everywhere, that's the thing. I mean, they're nothing like the targets that the government
We've
set.
had 220,000 people inquire for heat pumps in the last year to our company alone.
It's way below what the targets
well, no, the
that
government wants 600,000 by 2027, so look, our company alone has had the third of the inquiries needed to hit the government target in 3 years' time.
I think he wants installations, not inquiries.
The installations are held by an enormous amount of policy, which we can talk about as well. I was going to talk about electric cars very briefly. You should all watch a video by Johnny the Cabbie on YouTube, in which he gets his first electric cab and describes how cheap it is to run, how pleasant it is to drive, and so much better than the diesel it replaces. And the batteries, you can't recycle petrol, but electric vehicle batteries have got a life now of up to 600,000 miles, at the end of which they can either be recycled or used as static batteries in homes and grids to help deal with the problem Tim is worried about what do we do when it's not windy. So actually, they're a huge upgrade on fossil fuels, because with fossil fuels, we have to keep paying to get it out of the ground and turn it to carbon dioxide. With batteries, they're a permanent asset.
Can I just come on a few of those? Look, 10 years ago, an offshore wind farm that was commissioned in the UK cost about 3 times the retail price of electricity. It has come down faster than if I was on the show 10 years ago, faster than I could ever have believed it to be possible. Stable framework for business to work in, exactly as Greg is saying. Gentleman here asked, why can't we all just come together on it? Look, a lot of this affects people's lives, and you can't take politics out of people's lives. You always need a show like this for us to be able to have these discussions, and it's the right way to do it. But actually, there's broadly, I'd say, in the UK, a pretty decent cross-party agreement on it, more so than you have in other countries. I do think we have to throw everything at it. I think that includes nuclear, absolutely. I think that's maybe a difference between Labour and the Green Party. I think on that, you've got to throw everything at this because it's so important. A colleague asked, a member of the audience here asked about carbon capture and storage. Yes, it's really important, because if you don't have that kind of technology, all you will do to hit these targets is offshore British industry, and that is not the way to do it. You've got to look at how we can continue to have the kind of industrial base, the jobs base, actually have more of that because of the process. And if you don't have that kind of technology, you're not going to be able to have those kind of industries in the future. So that long-term investment from the government to deliver that system is really, really important.
All right, look, I'm going to... we will come back to this subject, I know. I'm just going to move on, because there's other questions I want to get to. Before I do, I would like to tell you that next week we are in Trowbridge in Wiltshire, and the week after that we're in London. So if you live in or around either of those two places, and you'd like to be part of the audience, like our audience tonight, follow the instructions on the Question Time website, and hopefully I shall see you in Trowbridge or in London. Right, let's take our next question, which is from Adrian Tucker.
Is Donald Trump and Elon Musk a good combination?
A good combo. Well, there's a question. Yes, so we've got Elon Musk, who is, along with tech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, they are now something called the Department for Government Efficiency, which is a kind of advisory body to the government. There's all sorts of other nominations by Donald Trump as well, in terms of Attorney General, Justice Secretary, Head of National Intelligence, that have raised more than a few eyebrows. Tim?
Somebody said that we've already reached the stage of Caesar appointing his horse to the Senate. I wouldn't go that far. In fact, Donald Trump's appointments make sense from his point of view and his experience in government. He thinks the problem with his first term was he was surrounded by disloyal people who didn't actually follow through on his ideas. So he's hiring people who are qualified principally because of their loyalty. In the case of Elon Musk, there's also a synergy with philosophy. He is of the view that...
I mean, they didn't used to be, because Elon Musk used to support the Democrat Party.
Yeah, that's very true, and I'm sure on many social and cultural questions there may well still be some disagreement, but where they agree is that the right globally is turning against what they describe as the administrative state. And the theory, which has been expressed, by the way, by Kemi Badenoch, the new leader of the opposition, is that government is now so big it's getting in the way of governing. And America has many problems with regulation, as we have in this country. So you'll all be aware of HS2 and the infamous bat shed that cost £100 million to preserve the local bat population. I'm pro-bat, but I've got a bat hedge that would have cost a lot less than that. So we have problems with regulation like that. And likewise, in California, they've been attempting to build high-speed rail, and they've managed to build just a few feet of it. They've built some sort of bridge, and not much further than that, and it's cost them billions. And this is the problem, is they're tied up with red tape. So the idea is that you go in with someone like Elon Musk, who's an outsider, who isn't trapped by the institutions, hasn't been co-opted by the bureaucracy, and he can look at the laws and the rules which are not working and which are getting in the way of business, and he can tear them up. So this is the kind of appointment that, yeah, OK, you look at that and think, is all of this just about trolling the world? Is this just about having a laugh? No, this is actually quite serious people who for nearly a decade have been thinking about the problems of Western governance and are now leaping on that and trying to find ways of making government work again.
What do you think about some of the other picks? I mean, the news has been full over the last couple of days. I mean, you've got I mean, these are yet to be appointed. These are nominations by Donald Trump. Pete Hegseth as Defence Secretary. So he's in charge of one of the, if not the biggest military in the world. He's an army vet, but he's also a TV presenter with no experience in government.
I'm a TV presenter, and I hope that someday I shall run a government department. I'm a TV pundit. Anyway, I'm a TV pundit. No, he is also a decorated veteran, and he's well known for his work on veteran affairs, which is a major issue for Trump. And this is the case with a lot of his appointments, that what they don't do is they don't come from within Washington. But I don't agree they don't necessarily have appropriate experience.
OK. Greg?
Hey, first of all...
As the entrepreneur on the panel, obviously Elon Musk is an entrepreneur par excellence.
And first of all, putting aside everything about what we see in the sort of degree of political extremism at the moment, Elon Musk did do an enormous amount to drive the electric vehicle revolution, and with it, the electrification of large parts of our economy. And actually, I'm glad that that will be part of a new US administration. I
mean, Donald Trump's also talking about drill, baby, drill. So,
yeah, I was going to say,
there's
the data,
two extremes there, potentially.
Yeah, forgive me for looking at the data, but I think Donald Trump in his last government was a big proponent of coal, but US coal use fell by 40%. Texas, the most free market bit of the US, has 72% renewables. It's because it's the cheapest form of power and they can build it. So, there are lots of things in the space that I look at, that I can say, hey, look, there's something to see there. But on government efficiency, I do think governments have a duty to be efficient. I do worry that creating a new department for it, by the way, is yet another bureaucracy. And it might be better to push efficiency through departments. But technology use within government has got to be something we improve in order to deliver better services to citizens and to help bring down taxes over the long run. Because I think we need to free up that money for economic growth. And we all depend on public services. And if we make that more efficient, we'll all benefit.
Fancy a role in government?
Cutting
waste and bureaucracy?
I chose business because we could actually more directly and more quickly identify what we think is right and act on it. But we take bets, if you like, with our own capital and with our investors' capital. And I think it's hard in government because they have to justify everything they do when sometimes we don't know whether it's going to work or not. So I think government utilising the power of entrepreneurship and the ability of the private sector to innovate is actually going to be really important if we're going to be a competitive economy going forwards.
OK. And there in the blue top.
Is there an argument that both Elon and Trump are running the US like a business? Because they both started out as Democrats.
I mean, I'm sure there are Republican businessmen as well, in case you're suggesting that just because they're Democrats, that was an issue. And you think that's a bad thing?
No, I think they both share similar minds, and they're both trying to run it like a business.
OK. All right. Woman in the white top.
Perhaps if we were running our country a little bit more like a business, we wouldn't be in the hole that we're in right now. If we had some more entrepreneurship...
Jonathan, Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
They're an interesting mix. I think, look, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he won very big. He has the right to pick his administration. He will probably get his picks because of the Republican clean sweep. And
have you been surprised by any of the... I know your job is to get on with them all, of course.
Of course.
But, and I knew you were going to say that. But have you been surprised by any of these nominations?
Well, look, in terms of the appointments, particularly on trade and particularly on policy in relation to China, they're broadly the names that we would have expected as a British government for a Republican win in the election. I mean, look, we've got to work with whoever are democratically elected in our partner countries. And there are opportunities for the UK from this. There is the opportunity, I think, in trade space to do things around British services, having access to American markets, around technology, around defence. Got to be frank with people, there's some really hard bits as well. The reason we don't have a trade deal as present between either the US and the EU or with the UK is really difficult areas like agriculture, which would require a very big national conversation. But we've got to engage in good faith around it. I think it's also necessary to say, you know, it's potentially the case we could face some very big questions as a country, because it's not just about the UK's relationship to the US, it's about the EU, which is still one of our by far our biggest market. It's about the relationship with that wider policy to China, where if we did what the US does in terms of its policy, it'd be much more painful for European countries. So there's a lot to go on
here. And how are you going to manage that balance between the UK facing the EU or facing the US? I realise it may not necessarily be either or, but the UK could find itself in that position if we're trying to make sure that tariffs don't affect the UK if they end up affecting the EU.
Yeah, that is clearly the challenge, you know, and that is clearly, you know, you never know from a presidential campaign how much of the rhetoric around the campaign will manifest itself in direct policy that will come forward. But that, exactly as you said, is the issue. There are things that we might be offered from the US that would then cause problems for what we currently sell to the EU. It's equally the case that the US might offer things to the EU, which, if they accepted, would put us out of alignment with that. Most of all, we've got to be clear with people that if we had a bigger, wider East-West trade war, you know, confrontation between China and the West, that would be very, very painful for everyone across the global economy. So there's a chance to avoid that, to work with people and to do that. There's a lot of gains that could be had if we could get round these problems, but we will have to be canny and we'll have to get the best deal for the UK, and it's as simple as that.
Woman here in the front.
You talk about a trade deal with the US. Now he's a democratically elected MP. Would Mr Farage not be able to act as a bridge into that new government?
Well, he already has a job. he already has a job, and he's tried pretty hard to get into Parliament, so we'd probably leave him to, you know, try and do that job for the people.
I mean, he has offered that, and he's clearly on friendly terms with Trump.
In very diplomatic terms, I would say what you want from any representative of the British government is someone who represents British interests to that country rather than that country's interests back to the UK. But look, the guy's got a job and he should stick to that for the term he's been elected for as a Member of Parliament.
OK. Got two men in this row here. Let's hear for you with a grey shirt. Yes.
I think Elon Musk being so close to the heart of the American government is really scary. I think, you know, putting aside the fact that, you know, SpaceX has a lot of government contracts, so there's a big conflict of interest there. He owns, like, one of the largest propaganda machines on the planet. And we all know it's filled with bots. And we all know that him having such a close tie to a president who, you know, has said some very scary things on record, and he's, you know, behind a policy, what the Project 2025.
So this is, just to explain, this is a policy led by a think tank, I think it's fair to describe it, in the US, which has come with all sorts of ideas on the right of the agenda, which may or may not be influencing the Trump presidency.
Yeah, it's just having that combination of him controlling such a large part of social media and being that close to a president who I don't trust, I think is terrifying.
OK, man next to you.
With Trump and Elon Musk in US government, has the UK government got any new up-and-coming trade deal plans with the European Union?
OK, well, I think you sort of touched on that just now. If you give me... There's a woman at the back.
So you see a combination of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Elon Musk put a lot of money into the presidential election. Could you see it as a way that he bought himself into government?
Right, OK. And the man in the same row, yes. Yes, you, sir, with a...
Yep. Obviously, Musk and Donald Trump have got similar views on Ukraine. Don't you find it not a bit worrying that they're going to cut the funding for Ukraine and leave Europe on its own.
Obviously, we don't know yet if that's going to happen, but they certainly have talked, or certainly Donald Trump has talked about that possibility. Ellie?
Yes, well, to return to your original question, is Trump and Musk a good combo? I mean, absolutely not. You know, I've watched kind of open mouth this week with the set of appointments that we've seen from Trump, and you really couldn't make it up. And it's been quite funny to hear Greg sort of saying, well, you know, let's be reassured because Trump says one thing and does another. That's not reassuring. You've heard...
I didn't say that. Just to be really clear.
I didn't hear that, but okay.
I pretty much wrote it down here, but anyway.
I spoke about coal. That was the one thing.
OK. And Tim said, you know, about getting rid of red tape. Well, one person's red tape is another person's important social and environmental protections, right? So I think we've really got reason to be worried about this move in America, and particularly because these are really serious times. So we need serious people at the top in the most powerful country in the world. And to pick up the point that the gentleman made there about Ukraine, I mean, I share your anxiety, to be honest, because, you know, I mean, of course, ultimately, any conflict has to come to a negotiated settlement in the end, but you've got to negotiate from a position of strength. And if we have Trump saying, basically, I'm happy to pull the rug out from under Ukraine, I mean, that's a complete betrayal, essentially. So I am genuinely worried about the direction of Trump, and I think it's all the more important, then, that, yes, we do strengthen our relationship with our European partners, and that we stand up for our values as well, and definitely not roll over in front of what could be quite a loose cannon America over the coming few years.
So just because you brought me in, Ellie, can I just say very clear, I think the point about democracy and about buying elections and owning propaganda platforms is genuinely concerning. And I really worry in a world where you know, misinformation is already a major threat, that misinformation under such direct political control is even worse. And so I couldn't agree more with the point you make.
So Damian, you're obviously, we've got Jonathan here who's in government, and so has to be very diplomatic about what he says about Donald Trump and any appointments he makes. You're not in government, and unless there's a cataclysm in the Labour Party, you're not going to be for some, you know, for a good 3 or 4 years at least. So you can be a bit more honest. What do you think about Donald Trump and Elon Musk as a combo?
So Donald Trump and Elon Musk, Adrian asked, are they a good combination? Well, why not? Look, Donald Trump has just been elected President of the United States. And, you know, you can have all the discussions you like about whether you think that's a good idea, whether you would have voted that way or not, but that's entirely academic. One of the world's, you know, larger functioning democracies has elected Trump to be the president, and that is the reality.
Now, you're just being asked your opinion.
No, I'm giving my opinion.
Elon Musk.
And my opinion, no, and I'm absolutely going to give you my opinion on that. Look, I'm not the world's #1 fan of Twitter, but I do think you have to admire what Elon Musk has done in his business development with Tesla. Going against the grain, not just with the design of the car, but, you know, probably buying your own or developing your own charging infrastructure. It's probably not what most business consultants would have advised, but he's made a great success of it. Now, yes, of course, you have to deal with those conflicts of interest, but here's a guy who perhaps can bring some radical ideas. And actually, for all Western democracies, including ours, you know, you've got an ageing population, you've got more and more demands on the state. Affording the great public services that we all want becomes harder over time. Our tax burden went to its highest ever as a result of COVID. But we've just had a budget where it's going to go even higher again. And you just can't keep on doing that forever. You have to find innovative, better ways of doing things that does deliver those great public services, but does so at better value.
There is an
like what
irony
Musk has done with X. I mean... Hang on,
one at a time.
This is one media platform. I work in the media. It's overwhelmingly left-wing, and it overwhelmingly preferred Biden. Oh, you mean the New York Times, CNN, these were not pulling in one particular liberal direction? And as to the point about money in politics, that ain't new. The Democrats do receive donations, and they do receive donations, I'm sure, from journalists. OK, so there's one mad media mogul who's right-wing, but the vast majority of the rest of them are very left-wing.
Just a very brief point I was going to make on Tesla. The irony of Tesla, of course, is that its success was entirely, very heavily dependent on government subsidies, state subsidies, government mandates and government loans. and SpaceX, similarly, is very dependent on government support. So there is an irony here that, in a way, what we're talking about, we were talking earlier about subsidy for clean energy or something, that on the one hand, you've got a bunch of people who politically don't seem to like that stuff, but have built enormous businesses off the back of it. And so I think, actually, there's a grown-up message here, which is we can talk about how do innovation and government work together to drive the change that enables them to become so successful in a way that's good for the planet. That's not about Tesla specifically. It's just to note there is a huge irony that they were so dependent on the government to get there.
Okay.
We should also say as well, as hard as it is, right, the nature of life being a politician, we come and go. That all political careers end in failure, right?
Here today,
there
gone
will be
tomorrow.
Absolutely,
Someone
right?
once said he sat in his chair.
You'd be on Question Time one day and you're gone the next, right? The fact is, there have been, since the end of the Second World War, very different prime ministers, very different presidents. This relationship is about more than just whoever the short-term political leaders are. America's role in NATO, in protecting Europe for that time, should not be forgotten. And we should always be trying, even when it's maybe more difficult, to remember that that's the kind of common friendship and relationship that has endured for a long time and will be there long after the current sets of political leaders. And we're all good.
Well, listen, let's talk about governments a bit closer to home then with our next question, which is from Jill. Jill Harris.
After such a cruel blow to small business in the recent budget, how does the government hope to encourage entrepreneurship?
All right, well, look, Jonathan, obviously I'm going to come to you first on this. So what you're talking about, Jill, I assume, is the increase in national insurance contributions by employers and possibly also about
business assets disposal relief.
The increase in the national living wage and also greater rights for workers. Is that right?
Amongst other things, yes. Yeah.
Right, OK. And do you run a small business?
Yes.
So just tell me how it's affecting you then.
Because we don't have a huge number of employees, the negatives and positives of the changes in national insurance don't have a great impact on us, but I know many people that do. I have a friend who is a hairdresser and his costs are going to go up £2,000 a month as a result of the increase in the national minimum wage and also the changes in the national insurance.
So, look, you've got Jill there. You've also got the British Retail Consortium today, and they represent hundreds of retailers, small and large, saying that these differences, together with a cost from a raft of other regulation, workers' increased rights for workers being one of them, it will make job losses inevitable and higher prices a certainty. I mean, you're sitting here as Business Trade Secretary. I mean, how can you think that's a good idea?
Well, look, let me state my case, Jill. First of all, for small businesses, actually, they were protected in the budget. So employment allowance doubled, and the threshold by which you can still qualify for that was removed. So actually, there's about 1 million small businesses in the country who will pay less or the same in national insurance contributions than they would have before the budget. So that's the specific position for small businesses. I would, however, readily acknowledge that there are some things we've asked a lot from business of in this budget, because frankly, we had no choice around that. I've never known a time where a government has come to power and had to find money, not for the things it promised to do in its manifesto, but for the things the previous government promised. There are areas of my department, compensation for postmasters, money for the steel industry, money for the advanced manufacturing plan, even before we consider things like money for the inflected blood scandal. All things, Fiona, people have been on this programme and said we should compensate.
So to Jill's question,
yeah.
How can you hope to encourage entrepreneurship?
Because the first basis for any kind of business success is fixing the foundations, is having a stable environment. That is what we've had to do with the first budget, a once-in-a-parliament event to do that. The impetus to growth comes from things like planning reform, letting businesses get on and do what they want, skills reform, the changes to the apprenticeship levy, the changes to the pensions system, which the Chancellor's announcing at Mansion House this evening, billions of pounds being freed up to invest in business. Also, long-term public investment, which we talked about at the start of the programme, the OBR saying, boosting the productive capacity of this country over the long term with better infrastructure. All these things are essential. And we've done that whilst protecting small business, whilst protecting your pay packet on income tax, on the national insurance that employees pay, and on VAT. So it has been challenging, but we've had to do that. And if we didn't have that honesty, that credibility, that ability to fix the foundations and look to the long term, there could be no more success. So that is the pitch. Some bits have been hard, I acknowledge that. But specific to your question, we've protected smaller business and put in the conditions for success for the long term.
Quite a few hands up here. A woman at the back in the red top.
Yes, you say you got that budget to protect small businesses. However, I have been a business owner myself, and I'm also an employee as well. And so I see different sides of it. Sure. And I feel, how can, first of all, as an entrepreneur, I'm also wanting to start up a new business, but I'm not encouraged by what government are offering. And quite frankly, I'd rather stay and be an employee. Also, on the effect of employees, those on the lower income, how can we sustain paying that increase in the national insurance? It's just not right. There's something wrong there, and it needs to be reviewed.
All right, so listen, Greg, let me come to you. I'm obviously not asking you to speak for the government, far from it. But as a business person, obviously an entrepreneur, you know, you're CEO of a hugely successful energy company. You've heard Jill, and you've heard the woman at the back there, neither of which are in any way enamoured of these changes.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I feel for them. I think it's hard running a business at any scale. It's brutally hard, and adding more burdens makes it harder. I think the backdrop is actually that governments around the world have been struggling to sort out their finances following the enormous hole driven by the pandemic and then by the gas crisis, between them knocking hundreds of billions of pounds off our public finances. And we have to fix those holes, or it will be a drag on the economy forever.
But you also have to encourage businesses to grow, and you've got the woman back there saying, I don't want to start a business, I'd rather be an employee.
Right? And by the way, I think bureaucracy is as hard as cost sometimes, right? Because the red tape that means you've got to be thinking all the time about the regulation that is burdening you is another reason not to do it. But I was going to say, there are things you can do outside of the exchequer. And I think that if the government's sorting the public finances through the reason we can wear it, as long as it's buying time to do two things. One is to drive reform and efficiency through the public sector so that we can start to bring the tax burden down. And we know that productivity growth in the private sector has been far greater than that in the public sector because of the adoption of technology. And we need now to radically, to enable the hard-working people of the public sector, to give them the tools to do a better job more efficiently and more cheaply. I think the second thing we need to be doing is finding the non-tax ways of improving our economy. Look, we've got the highest electricity costs in Europe, possibly in the world, right? Every business is affected by those costs. I was talking earlier about the fact that when we're building wind turbines and solar farms, we should be driving down energy costs. And we need the market reforms now so that consumers and businesses benefit from the change in the energy sector. Countries that have done this, by the way, Scandinavia, since it introduced something called locational pricing of energy, has attracted £75 billion of investment in steel, in AI data centres, in energy-intensive industries, in a time when I think we've attracted about £5 billion. So if we can bring down energy costs, it will help every business. And I think we need to use the recent tax changes to buy time, but we have to now do the really hard stuff, both in the public sector and for the services we all use.
Damian.
I have to say, I think, Johnny, there'll be business people, small business owners across the country hearing a government minister saying we've protected small businesses, and they will hear that in absolute astonishment.
You can employ 4 people on the living wage without paying any national insurance contributions at all because of that change.
It's not just the employer national insurance contributions, though, is it? It's also business rates. If you're in leisure, hospitality or retail, the relief on business rates is going to be reduced. And then we're going to have French-style labour laws, which will be a brake on people taking a risk, on expanding their business. And by the way, also your threshold on the employment allowance also acts as a bit of a brake because there's an effect sometimes if people want to stay the right side of that cliff edge. It was an extraordinary thing in this budget that for weeks and weeks in the run-up to it, we kept hearing about how the most important thing was growth. And this was presented as if it was some sort of novel concept. All governments, forever, have been wanting to promote economic growth. But we assumed, after all this talk, that when Rachel Reeves stood up at the dispatch box, she was going to unveil the great growth plan of all time. Not only were there no growth-promoting measures in the budget, it actually had the effect of reducing the projected growth. And what you said about the OBR saying, oh, they've given us a clean bill of health and a gold star for increased productive capacity. No, they have downgraded the growth forecast for this country. And I really worry that this new government has lost sight of a really important point, and that is that the single most important thing for household living standards, for equality and for progress is employment. It's having a job. And look, we didn't get everything right in government. I wouldn't claim that for
Certainly
a moment.
not growth or productivity.
Hang on. We had the third highest growth since 2010 in the G7. It is true that there have been some big challenges.
For one quarter.
Hang on.
For one quarter. We have not got higher growth than the United States.
No, I said third highest in the G7. But what I was specifically talking about was employment. And when we came into government in 2010, employment was at 8%. It almost halved to 4.5% by the time we left. And it's easy to sort of lose sight of how important that is. But we always had this focus on trying to keep people in jobs. And I really worry that with this combination of what the new government has put in place, they've lost sight of the importance, the first importance of making sure that people can have a job.
Ellie. Well, let's start with what I think we can agree on. You know, we can agree that employment is really important, and we can agree that innovation and entrepreneurship is really important. And you know, I really sympathise with you there, with your question about worrying about the impacts of changes in policy on your ability to run a business. I think it's true that small businesses, there are processes for exempting them, but people above the threshold, as with any policy, are going to worry about it. But if employment is important, it's also important that it's employment that pays adequately. So I really support the increase in the minimum wage. You know, and I can see you nodding there. Exactly, this is the thing that unites us. Some years ago, people thought, yeah, but back in the day, people thought that minimum wage was a bad idea and would be terrible for growth, and actually it's turned out to be the opposite.
Hang on, Damien, let her answer. Damien, you've spoken for a long time.
You've spoken for a long time. Let Ellie answer, and raised it quite significantly.
And the reality is that people still need increases because there are too many people in employment not managing to get by and not managing to raise their households. So work has got to pay, employees have got to be protected, and entrepreneurs need support, especially when they're starting out. I think for me, the key thing about the budget that I found disappointing about it was that it could have made the decision to place the burden of taxes on wealth rather than on work, but it put it the other way round. Too much of the tax burden is falling on work. Whereas I would have liked to see capital gains tax, for example, raised so that it was in line with tax on income. Because it's crazy to me
that would
we've
destroy
still...
entrepreneurship. I mean, there's no country in the world that does that.
Why is it that people who are getting their income from stocks and shares are paying a lower effective rate of tax than people who are going out to work 9 to 5 days a day? What about introducing a wealth tax?
There's no country in the world that has a wealth tax like that. I mean, these are not real proposals. I've got to say that they've got to be the reality when you're the government, not made up things.
Tim.
And if you go after wealth, you go after the incentives that lead to people creating those businesses in the first place. I mean, I do feel for the government. It had a number of things it had to do, drive up growth. It had to plug that hole in the budget. It also had to stick to its promise not to raise direct taxes. And I suspect that what they chose to do was to go after what they regarded as low-hanging fruit. So there are these little tax raids or benefit cuts here. We'll cut the winter fuel allowance. We'll go after private schools. We'll raise national insurance. And individually, each one, they can sort of make an argument for and say, well, it doesn't hurt people in the round. It doesn't hurt people in the round. But if you are a small business person, you see the cumulative effect of the many different decisions, such that you're not just perhaps paying more tax, you're also now worrying, if you're a farmer, about inheritance tax down the line, you're worrying about the increasing costs of energy and of labour, and you're also thinking, what's Angela Rayner got in her back pocket when it comes to employee rights? All of these individual measures might be individually morally justifiable, but added together they make it very hard to grow. We have lost, Labour's only just been in for 5 minutes, give them a break. But we have lost a business population of 425,000 people since COVID, right? Entrepreneurship has gone down. We've got to get it back up again. The best way to do that is to get the government out of the way. If you don't do that, if you overtax, if you overregulate, what you'll do in the long run is kill the growth that generates the taxes that pays for Labour's social ambitions. And the consequence will be, in 2 or 3 years' time, Labour will come back and the taxes will be on you. They'll be personal taxes. Because at that stage, they'll have to apply them because they've run out of other places to tax. So this is what we call a doom spiral.
It is just, I think,
ain't a good
important to say. The UK has the lowest corporate tax of any major economy. And actually, 9 out of 10 businesses don't even pay the headline rate cost of the allowances. So I agree with that pitch, but you've got to take it in proportion.
OK. We've got about 9 or 8 minutes left, and I want to fit in this last question, so let's go for it. Olivia Rutherford, there you are.
Is the Australian government's proposal to ban under-16s from social media the best approach for protecting young people's mental health and safety, and should the UK follow?
Right, so what the Australian government is proposing, I mean, it's pretty radical, is that it would introduce legislation, it's yet to be debated in Parliament, but introduce legislation which would mean that anyone under 16 cannot access social media, or not lawfully anyway, and the sanction would be not on young people and not on the parents, but on the tech companies. They would be the ones who would be held responsible for making sure that the age verification was in place so that under 16s do not access it, and that includes TikTok, Facebook, Insta, you know, you name it. It's the whole kit and caboodle. Now, when I saw this question, I was intrigued, Olivia, and I had a little chat with you before the programme, and you're what, in your 20s, I think?
I'm 26.
26, and you don't have a smartphone?
Yes.
And why is that?
So I made a conscious decision not to have a smartphone about 6 months ago now. I was really concerned about my use of technology. It was dominating my life. You know, you've got notifications left, right and centre, and you only have to turn to newspapers to find people saying that they want to detox from their digital life. But specifically why I chose was just I was exhausted from overload of information. So I'm just, in my question here, thinking about young people, and I'm thinking these are young brains, and brain chemistry is very sensitive to digital devices. We've got a lot of parents at the shop I work at coming in, very exasperated, they can't get their children off the phones. We've got the issue of safety, but we've most importantly got the issue of mental health. What are they seeing online? And that point of comparison. I mean, we're all in the audience here, I'm sure we've got families and loved ones, and we're in a society that's increasingly feeling divided and fragmented because we're living our lives on our screens and not in the real world.
Okay.
So that's why I've made my decision.
Well, you make your argument very powerfully, Olivia. Now, we've not got long, so I want you all to be brief. I'm going to come just quickly to the audience. Yes, there's a woman in the back with a blue sweater on. Do you see in the middle there? Yes, let's hear from you.
Hi, so I wholeheartedly agree with what Australia is proposing, purely because it concerns me when I see, I mean, you can't help it, but see mothers out with really young children and all they're doing is looking on iPads. And I mean, I'm not much older than the woman who asked the question, and even I feel afraid of what this does to young people. And being through university and meeting people who've grown up in the 2000s, and their effect on their mental health is unbelievable compared to some of my peers.
OK, let's say the man here in the glasses.
I'm a teacher, and so I see this firsthand every day. I totally agree it should be banned for under-16s. I work in an infant school, and some of the things we hear on a daily basis is quite scary.
Like what?
Some of the things they will see in videos, there's a character called Huggy Wuggy, for instance, who scares children. It gives them nightmares, and they pop up in YouTube videos. And having to deal with that on a daily, not a daily basis, but around the country, it's dealt with daily. It's pretty scary. And I was just going to say that I've noticed in my short career of teaching, children's attention span has significantly reduced. It's really hard to do my job when the children can't listen for more than 5 minutes or need some sort of video, like portrayed in a YouTube-y way to be able to teach them.
I would say, so you're all going to have to be pretty brief. Greg?
I worry about it enormously. I've got two sons. The interesting thing, one's 18, and he navigates this world better than almost any adult I know. He's almost immune to the adrenaline rush of notifications, and he identifies misinformation actually far more quickly and ably than either me or some of my older relatives who post a lot of it on social media. And so I think it's a really complicated space because it's the world they're going to grow up into. And we've also got to work out at some point, how do you segue them into that world? And my younger son, he's 8, you know, I wake up some mornings and he's watching YouTube, but he's largely watching videos about, you know, football. And the moment you put a football in his hand, he runs outside and plays with it. And I think it's really hard for us to characterise the impact it has. So I think the social media companies behaved incredibly irresponsibly when they built the algorithms, when they identified that.
But do you
Discord...
agree, Greg, just quickly, because we've got so little time, do you agree with the Australian approach, banning them for under-16s?
I think we need to have a more sensible approach because you don't want to get to the age of 16 and suddenly be exposed to it. Right? You've got to learn to navigate.
Tim, yeah, be really brief.
Okay. Since 2012, tragically, rates of suicide, depression and self-harm among young people have gone up enormously. It correlates to the availability of smartphones. Something like 97% of adolescents in this country have access to a smartphone. It's estimated that around half of all 9-year-olds are on social media. There's a clear link. Government should ban it. If you knew there was some kind of toxin in the air that was damaging and harming young people's mental health in that way, you would want to do something about it. China's leading the way on this with things like TikTok. In TikTok, in China, young people can't use it for more than about an hour, and the government determines what kind of content is put out there. Not only would I ban social media use for young people...
There's obviously political censorship on
well, no, I mean, they skew the content towards educational and stuff like that. I think the day will come when you buy a smartphone, like a pack of cigarettes, there's a health warning on it, because it does harm your health.
Ellie, is it the Australian example particularly, is that something the Green Party would support?
I think it's a great question, Olivia, and you articulated your concerns really clearly, and I honestly share them. I think the banning it's a really strong policy. I've visited a school recently where they'd banned the use of smartphones within the school. It was joint secondary and primary school, and I personally completely agree with that. I think the workability and the justification of completely banning social media for young people is something that needs a bit more conversation, to be perfectly honest. But what I do think is we need far better regulation of social media, especially legal but harmful content.
Damian. So, I mean, Australia is absolutely going out on a limb here. I mean, no other country's done it.
No, I think everyone's starting to talk about things. Everyone's starting to talk about
whether they'll do it
like
and quite how it will work.
So
but in theory, in principle, rather, do you support it?
Yeah, look, a big issue we've got here is parents' FOMO. Because you don't want your child to be the only one in class who's not on the system. And for good reason. It was like when we were kids, the one kid in class who didn't have a television couldn't talk about Top of the Pops on a Friday morning. It's the same kind of thing.
That ages you.
But if you...
And me, I used to watch it.
Yeah, I started singing the theme tune. But if you ask children, there was a big survey that said to children, if you could turn off social media, not just for you, but for everyone else in the world, like your mum and dad included, and all grown-ups and all your friends, would you do it? And an extraordinarily high proportion, not a majority, but a really surprisingly high proportion say yes. And that is, I think, that's the debate we need to get to. There's a private members' bill coming up in Parliament next year, early next year. We'll see exactly where it ends up.
Yes,
but we have to have this national debate, because our friend in the audience there, the teacher, I mean, all of those things you mentioned, you could have added sleep.
Okay. Let me get to Jonathan, or we're going to run out of time.
Not having enough.
There is a private members' bill coming. It is not going anything like as far as what the Australian government is talking about. So let's just talk specifically about that. Is that something that your government could see
Look, I
being
have to know
introduced here?
more about the specific proposal, but I share a lot of the concerns that Olivia has put and the audience has put out. Greg's point about the algorithm, how young minds are kind of moulded by it, is definitely a concern. I'd say as well, since the election, since becoming a cabinet minister, I'm basically too busy to personally monitor my own social media. Apologies if that sort of offends anyone who thinks I'm there at every minute on it. But honestly, I feel more productive. I feel happier. I feel I get more done. I'm focused on what matters. I'm more with my family rather than checking my Twitter app, which I used to do as an MP, to be honest, every 5 to 10 minutes.
So then is this a role for government?
I think it's a bigger conversation that is required, and as ever, you're looking at kind of effectiveness and how will that work. But the kind of concerns we're seeing across a whole set of people here, I think, is a conversation, not just in our country, but in lots of places, we're increasingly going to have. I think it can do a lot of good as well, by the way. I think, modern communications have a great role to play, and tech innovation is really important. So you've got to get that balance right. But you can see the reaction in the audience here to this question.
And I have to say, it's something that gets discussed a lot on this programme. And given what the Australian government's doing, I suspect we'll revisit it. For now, I'm afraid we are out of time. That is all for this week. Thank you very much to the panel.
Thank you.
To the audience here in Basingstoke. Thank you to you at home for watching. Next week, Trowbridge in Wiltshire. See you there. Bye-bye.
Assisted dying, pensions and Trump's top team. Tonight's topics for newscast next on BBC One. Stay with us.
You have few friends, Cromwell.